Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Archival Discourses. Tonight, I'm going to be looking at another member of the Milner Group, Alfred Zimmern, and an essay of his called Greek Political Thought, and it's in a collection of essays on the legacy of Greece. So, just before we get into it, yes, I have launched channel memberships. So the Chatham House version series, except for episode 1, is now behind the paywall, as well as a few other streams on this channel. You all need to be based and red-pilled like Nami El Kazan and become a member. Thank you so much, Nami. It means a lot. And I'll remind you the tiers. 99p gets you fellow tier, so you get a little membership badge and emojis, which I'll add if enough people join. And if you join Orientis tier, which is $2.99 a month, you get access to the Chatham House series as well as other streams behind that tier. And also, if you join Pasha tier, you get the streams behind that tier. Okay, and let's bring up the essay in question. So, Alfred Zimmern, for anybody who's watched the stream I did with Semi Agog, is one of the members of the Milner Group. He's an interesting fellow. He's one of the academic influences on their thoughts, and he was kind of a very early globalist because he was one of the supporters of the creation of the League of Nations and very much wanted the Milner Group to go down this more internationalist globalist route. And this very much comes through in this essay we're going to read. So let's try and if we can make this a bit bigger. I don't know if that's working. Hang on. That's better. Okay. Right. So, political thought. In a survey of the legacy of ancient Greece to our modern civilization and its problems, it might well seem at first sight as though the political contribution of Greece could be ignored. Greek art, Greek literature, Greek philosophy are among the world's abiding possessions, for the human passions and questionings which gave them birth and the human needs to which they minister will last as long as human life itself. But Greek political thinking is so much bound up with the peculiar and evanescent external conditions of 5th and 4th century Greece, centres indeed so exclusively round the special problems of its intellectual metropolis, Athens, that its interest might appear to have passed away with the regime to which it owes its existence. The Agamemnon and the Antigone, they're both plays from that time period. Antigone is by Sophocles. Very tragic play. It's one of his Theban trilogy. It's Antigone, Oedipus Rex, and Oedipus at Colonna. Agamemnon, I forget who the author of that one was, but with their teachings of destiny and duty, the Hermes of Olympia and the Parthenon frieze, with their ever irresistible charm of youthfulness, the Phaedo with its discussion of immortality, and the metaphysics of Aristotle, with their still subtler and more abstruse speculations, source of so much of our Christian doctrine and apologetic, all these require little defence against the Philistine of today, if he can be induced to gaze at his intended victim before he delivers his blow. But Thucydides, with his long and detailed account of an intertribal or intermunicipal war, decked out with his sham speeches which were never delivered, Plato with his imaginary utopia, half a small Greek provincial town, half an impossible and unendurably regimented socialist model community, based on a fine-drawn and fallacious comparison between the qualities of the human soul and the class divisions which happened to prevail in the Greek society of the time. Aristotle, with his laborious investigations into the municipal pathology of his day and his detailed prescriptions for the betterment of his fellow provincials and their institutions. What have we to do with all this in an age of world problems and conflicts and of not merely continent-wide but international ideas and projects of organisation? The first duty of anyone who seeks to interest the modern reader in Greek political discussion is to be perfectly frank and lucid about its limitations. He needs have no cause to be afraid that, when these have been written off from his prospectus, there will be too little of value remaining. These limitations can be summarized under two main heads. They arise firstly from a difference of scale and secondly from a difference of outlook between ancient and modern political thought. The difference of scale leaps to the eye at once, although its consequences are not all of them so obvious. Ancient Greece was, for political purposes, a congeries of sovereign states, generally centering around the urban metropolis of a rural district smaller than that of a English county. The material upon which Greek political thought worked was therefore, from our modern point of view, not only small scale but also Lilliputian, that referring to the country of Lilliput from Gulliver's Travels, the nation of tiny people. This can be best appreciated when we consider how many gradations of scale are interposed in the modern world between the government of a town or district of the size of 5th century Athens and the government of our own sovereign state, the British Commonwealth. Athens was far smaller than Leeds, Johannesburg, or Chicago. Yet to be mayor of any of these is not to fill a position of commanding responsibility, as political responsibility is understood in the large-scale world of today. The American states, the South African province and dominion, and for certain purposes the English county, stand between the giant municipality and the sovereign parliament, to a British premier passing from a coal strike, which reacts upon the trade of the entire world, to an imperial conference engaged in tracing out an agreed line of policy on the Pacific question. The problems of a Pericles or even of an Alexander would seem but child's play. Let us see what results from this difference of scale. In the first place, Greek political thought, although, as we shall see, is aimed at universality and arriving at certain definite laws or conclusions about politics, never succeeded in divesting itself of a certain element of local or national individuality. When Plato in Thucydides, I'm sorry, I can see a comment from Nami. So, we can hear you twice. Oh, don't know why that's the case. Am I still coming through twice? Let me just check the audio settings. So, yeah, I'm on the right microphone, so I don't know why that's the case. If I'm, okay, good to know, Nami. Good to know, Nami. Thank you. Right, let's carry on. So, difference of scale leaps to the eye at once, although its consequences are not all of them so obvious. Ancient Greece was, for political purposes, a congeries of sovereign states, generally around the urban metropolis of rural districts smaller than the average English county. The material upon which Greek political thought worked was, therefore, from our point of view, oh, hang on, I'm repeating myself. Right, it's from this page. Engaged in tracing out an agreed line of policy on the Pacific question, the problems of a Pericles or even of an Alexander would seem but child's play. Let us see what results from this difference of scale. In the first place, Greek political thought, although, as you shall see, it aimed at universality and arriving at certain definite laws or conclusions about politics, never succeeding in divesting itself of a certain element of local or national individuality. When Plato and Thucydides think and write of the state, they are also thinking of the city and the same word, polis. Indeed, polis is the etymological root of our word polity as well as politics. It serves indeed for the two, and not merely of the city, i.e., of any municipality, but of a particular city. There are elements in Greek political thought which, just because they owe their inspiration to Athens, can never be universalized. A treatise on education in which general psychological conclusions were intermingled with conclusions based on experience at some English school with a very unique tradition were required to be carefully examined and applied with caution to the problems of adolescent life in Japan or Nigeria. Similarly, insofar as Greek political thought is Athenian, or to use a much disputed term, in which I hold it to be its proper sense, national, it is not truly political. The distinction what I am trying to draw is a difficult one and cannot be understood without a short digression about the nature of the study of politics. Politics is the study or activity of government, of the management of the public or common affairs of men. We need politicians, men who would devote themselves to meeting the demand for the management of our common affairs. We need them not because we are Englishmen, Irishmen, or Americans, but because we are human beings living together in society, and because our cooperative relations and activities require to be guided and controlled. Whether the politician is a tyrant or a minister of the people is not here to the point. The point is that he is the manager of what the Romans called res publica, the Latin for the good of Old English word commonwealth. Politics is therefore primarily concerned with the practical problems arising out of the fact that a number of different human beings are living together, and the more different they are, and the smaller their greatest common measure, the more truly political do such problems have become. The first business of the politician or governor is, as Aristotle said, to see that men shall live, the twin problems of supply and defence. His second, to see that they shall live well. In the first instance, the problems of health and physical development and well-being. In the last analysis, pure politics as our grand great-grandchildren may discover if ever the world state becomes a reality, is mainly concerned with administration. Administration of the affairs common to all is the interest of all. Now, ancient Greek politics were entangled, and modern politics also are still too largely entangled with the discussion of matters which are not common at all and do not constitute the material of politics in the true sense of the word, with questions arising not out of the common need for a common law, but out of the inner ultimate and ineradicable differences between the various nations and other groupings of mankind. When the League of Nations or the Dublin City Council is discussing an epidemic of smallpox, or the improvement of some dock or wharf, or schools for mothers, or the problem of juvenile employment, it is dealing with common interests which affect human beings as human beings. It is on the plane of politics proper, but when the Dublin City Council follows in the wake of the 19th century democratic movement throughout Europe, puts forward some proposal in order to give satisfaction to the sentiment that Ireland, being the home of a nation, ought to be a sovereign state, and when the League of Nations is asked to deal with the political situation created by the clash of contending nationalisms in the British Isles or elsewhere, both bodies as governing bodies are out of their depth. I find it interesting that he's arguing that local and international interests are somewhat aligned against the national interest. It's if I think of de Juvenal, the high-low versus the middle. I think kind of giving the game away a bit. Zimmern is, well, they're faced with an impossible task, established to deal with politics proper with the common affairs of men as men. They're bound to flounder helplessly when they are cajoled into the thorny, intimate, and there'd be added, far more fascinating region of national individual personality, to a region where the deeper you penetrate, the less common, uniform, standardized, or standardizable are the interests involved, and the less susceptible of being settled or even understood by the rough and ready politician accustomed to deal with matters in the bulk and to measure up the results of a quantitative reckoning in the cold and cosmopolitan language of statistics. In reading the Greek political writers, then, we must be careful to distinguish the universal from the local and ephemeral element. The latter is indeed of great interest and value, but we shall tend to miss the really precious and permanent elements in their thought if we do not take pains to disentangle Thucydides, the disillusioned Athenian patriot, from Thucydides, the scientific historian and psychologist, and Plato, the aristocrat born out of a due season from Plato, the unrivaled student of human nature and of the permanent needs of human society. The failure to recognize this distinction has led to so much misunderstanding and shallow thinking in attempts to apply Greek ideas and maxims too literally to modern life. It is only too common to hear Englishmen whose knowledge of politics and history outside the newspapers is confined to stray reminiscences from a not very ardent pursuit of the classics in their school and college days, basing confident predictions on the failures of democracy on some obiter dictum of Thucydides or Plato, and assessing the fate of the British Commonwealth in terms borrowed from some judgment of Sallust or Tacitus on its wholly different Roman prototype. Interesting that he does distinguish between the Greeks and the Romans rather than falling into this tend to sweep amongst classicists of grouping the two together. It is flippancy or pedantry like this which gives rise to the onslaughts of a Cobden or Herbert Spencer or an H.G. Wells, and to the practical man's suspicion of a classical education. One might go as to last year's market reports for guidance in a business deal of today as have recourse to Plato, or for that matter to Machiavelli, in an existing political emergency. If a classical education, designed as it is in England to promote character rather than intellect, a vicious distinction which leaves no room for such a quality as intellectual integrity, often leaves behind it but a meagre residuum of knowledge and ideas, it should at least cause the public school man of yesterday and the London clubman of today to realise the limitations of his field of study and to abstain from confident political generalisations. The Labour MP, who once remarked to the writer apropos of an Indian debate that he had been in the House just long enough to know that all he knew about India was that he knew nothing about it, has been brought up, if not in a better, at least in a cannier school. Well, that's why we should have a better quality politician, and that democracy tends to bring down to the lowest common denominator. There is no sounder training for the student of politics and history, or indeed of any serious subject, than to know everything about something, whether it be the chronological order of Plato's dialogues or the problem of humidity in weaving sheds, or about placing a field or keeping a wicket. That is why the Duke of Wellington, who, if he lacked the intellectuality of a Foch, or at least knew both his England and his own job in military science, selected the playing fields rather than the classical classrooms of Eton as the home and training ground of that concentrated and disinterested endeavour of mind and spirit which had carried his army through patient years of effort to victory. It is all to the good that our classical devotees, faced with criticism and competition from many quarters, should be acquiring both a greater humility and a greater seriousness. Our first caution, then, is that Greek political thought is both national and universal, that we must learn to distinguish what pertains to nationality from what pertains to government. I mean, ultimately, yes, it's true that there's a national and a universal element, but we need to understand what actually means. National would be the local city-state, so Athens or Sparta's own interests, where universality, we could say, okay, the Greek body as a whole, the whole civilization is one universal world, but that's not the same as modern universalism, which talks about global governance of trying to manage the whole world's cultures, societies, and languages in one great hodgepodge. I think that it would be folly to try and draw some comparison between those two. A second result, which flows from the small-scale character of Greek politics, is that we nowhere find an adequate treatment of the problem of foreign relations. Foreign policy is one of the weak spots of modern democracy. It is perhaps the element in our political technique which is most in need of thoroughgoing revision. We have yet to induce the modern citizen to pay continuous attention to issues which, although they are seemingly remote from his purview, may at any moment shake the whole fabric of his everyday existence. And when we have done this, we have to persuade him to approach these world problems not in a spirit of competitive aggrandizement, but with a view of discovering what is the best line of policy in the interest of the world as a whole. So long as the peoples remain self-absorbed, the governments will continue to conduct their mutual relations on the basis of individual self-interest, and the meetings of the Assembly of the League of Nations will remain what they are at present, not gatherings of statesmen solely bent, each from his own angle and upbringing, on the welfare of humanity, but barterings of politicians who, with rare exceptions, have come to the fair to do the best business they can for their own clients. Now, Thucydides and Plato give us no help for the League of Nations. Such a phrase as the interest of humanity as a whole would have been politically meaningless to them. They did not think of humanity as a whole. They thought of it as divided sharply into two sections, Greeks and barbarians, and of the Greek world as a small oasis of intelligence and culture ringed round by a wide and indefinite expanse of barbarism. Well, base Greeks, that's how you should view the world. We also, it is true, speak of advanced and backwards peoples, but the latter are not, as they were to the Greeks, a formidable mass, tribe upon tribe of military power, extending up to and beyond the known or legendary confines of the world. They are child races under our watchful care and control. We have explored and surveyed the whole earth, and where we find weakness or inferiority, we establish a trusteeship. To the Greeks, ever on their guard against barbarian inroads from north, south, east, and west, from Scythians and Libyans, Persians and Carthaginians, the mandate clause of the covenant would have seemed both theoretically undesirable and practically impossible. No Greek writer ever dreamed of a system of international cooperation between the governments of the world as men then knew it. All of them thought in terms of competition and ever-recurrent warfare at best, or a precarious balance of power. Even Plato's Utopia had its soldier class, and they were real soldiers, not merely police. In this respect of her population relieved from military duty and available for productive tasks, has the advantage over the most ideal construction of ancient Greece. There is a further point to be noted under this head. If Greek thought gives us no guidance in foreign policy, it is no more helpful, except very indirectly, in another difficult region, that of industrial policy. The problem of industrial policy, or what is sometimes roughly described as the labour problem, may perhaps be thus stated: how to secure or maintain for civilised mankind, or for our own particular section of it, the goods and services it needs, whilst at the same time providing justice and freedom for those who produce them. To put it more shortly, how to secure that a good life for the consumer shall be compatible with the good life for the producer. It is a problem which goes to the root of democracy, for the world has never yet known a time when the increase of wealth and the consequent growth of refinement and civilization in the upper section of the community did not lead to degradation and injustice in the lower. It's important to remember that Zimmern is talking in the early 20th century, so this is sort of a post-industrial revolution where you've had this great improvement in the efficiency and productivity, but also a great increase in the amount of poverty and squalor. Here too, the Greeks can give us no help. They do not even face the problem but fail to solve it, like the Romans. Their material civilization was so simple that the problem hardly arose for them at all, except in certain cases, such as that of the mine slaves. But the fact that they acquiesced without a twinge of conscience or a trace of repining in the institution of slavery indicates how they would probably have faced it had it arisen. Confront Plato with the complexity of modern industry, prove to him as any modern lecturer could, that for northern man at any rate, life can only be maintained without degradation on the basis of widespread industrialism, and with our familiar equipment of railways, steamships, telephones, et hoc genus omni, and it is safe to predict that he would fail to give the reply which the modern reformer would expect from him. Instead of embracing one of the many current variants of socialism which masquerade as his bastard progeny, he would either accept his interlocutor's premises and tell him to build up his precious northern civilization on the basis of slavery, or reject them and advise him with Samuel Butler to make a bonfire of the machines. The latter is indeed the more probable alternative, for it is that which the more thoughtful and prophetic, perhaps one can also add the more Hellenic, of our modern guides are turning. When the men so diverse as Tagore, the Indian sage, and Raphael, the German trust magnate, tell us that the disease from which we are suffering is mechanization, and that our crying need is for greater simplicity, it seems safe to predict that Plato would not reject the possibility of providing a good life for the modern man in the world divested of most of the rattling and tinkling paraphernalia of which the 19th century so plumed itself as the inventor. Let us now pass to our second limitation, arising not from the difference of scale, but from the difference of outlook between the Greek and modern speculation. We can best sum this up by saying that whereas modern political thought, like modern thought generally, works from the inner to the outer, from the individual to the state and society, the ancient thinkers habitually work in the opposite direction, setting the interests of the community or state above those of the individual. This is what Fustel de Coulanges intended come to convey when he declared that ancient man had no conception of the meaning of liberty. Yes, that's Fustel de Coulanges, the author of The Ancient City, a book I'd highly recommend everybody read. It will really revolutionize your conception of the ancient world, especially the Greeks and Romans, because we have a tendency to look back on them as these kind of, liberal democrats ultimately, from which we get our modern society from, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The ancient city was paternalistic, patriarchal, and incredibly nationalistic. It was based on these paternal little family clan units, and it's these little patriarchies who would partake in the governance and politics of the day. Liberty is no doubt a somewhat confusing and ambiguous term. It is hard to cut it loose from its political associations. From national independence and democratic self-government, we can perhaps therefore improve upon the French writer by saying that the Greek political thinkers do not recognize or do not make proper allowance for rights and responsibilities of the individual soul. Just as they failed to distinguish between nationality and government, so they failed also to distinguish between conscience and public duty. Socrates, indeed, meeting his death in obedience both to conscience and law, had a glimpse of the higher truth, but his followers did not take up this side or his message, or insofar as they did so in their study of individual morality. They did not relate it to their theories of politics. It was a greater than Socrates who summed up and put the problem with his incomparable directness and irony. Render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto gods the things which are God's. If this had been said in the presence of Thucydides, the keenest practical brain that applied itself to Greek political thinking, he simply would not have known what it meant. To him, Caesar and God, or to translate them to their own language, Athens and Athena were not opposing but practically identical terms. Very interesting that he's talking about the idea of the Greeks being more like the Magians, as Spengler would describe them, as not having any idea of the separation between church and state. But perhaps we could say this is more an invention of our modern West than necessarily the classical world. When the Athenian, as he described him, spent his body as a mere external tool in the city service and counted his mind as most truly his own when employed on her behalf, he was, according to the universal Greek belief, serving both his God and his neighbour, both his own highest good and the noblest of the world's causes. His life was a unity, for he had not yet learned to disentangle his soul from the soul of the city or the herd, or his God from the soul of the God of Israel or of Athens. The Greek thinkers, as we shall see, sincerely endeavoured to distinguish between the good citizen and the good man, and to base the state on foundations of the spirit. but their work was vitiated by their failure to realise the extent and urgency of the claim of the individual soul. Men must be spiritually free before they can cooperate politically on the highest terms. In the last analysis, the weakness of Greek political speculation can be traced back to the weakness of Greek religion. Even Plato played with pagan orthodoxy and gave the Delphic Apollo a titular place in his Utopia, proving himself as timid in touching Greek superstitions as English thinkers today are in touching the monarchy. It is this basis of insincerity which reveals itself throughout the superstructure. Greek political thought contains already the germs of the disease which, centuries later, led men, the plebeians first, later patricians also, to turn away from the outworn symbols that stood for the union of church and state and to seek comfort in a religion which, if it undermined and eventually overturned the last and greatest of the ancient empires, established a city of the soul upon a firm and enduring basis. Julian's Viciste Galilee marked the end of one strain or tradition in ancient political thought, which, originating in the local worships of the city-state, had lasted on with gathering momentum until all over the known world men bowed the knee before the altar of Caesar, the god emperor. From this, there was no way forward except through revolution, and mankind paid in the night of the Dark Ages for sins of compromise and insincerity committed during long centuries of enlightenment. The liabilities thus frankly stated, let us turn to the assets. The first valuable contribution the Greeks made to political study was that they invented it. It is not too much to say that before 5th century Greece, politics did not exist. There were powers and principalities, governments and subjects, but politics was no more existed than chemistry existed in the age of alchemy. An imitation of an idea, as Plato has taught us, is not the same as an idea, nor is the imitation of a science the same as a science. Ramses and Nebuchadnezzar, Croesus and the Lydian and Cyrus the Persian ruled over great empires, but within their dominions there was no politics because there were no public affairs. I'm going to push back on what he's saying here, and no, I disagree that politics, I think, is endemic to the human condition. Just because your politics is not a republic or not democratic does not mean this is not political. I think this is a very childlike and libtarded way of viewing things. There were only private affairs of the sovereign and his ruling class. Government and all that pertained to it, from military science and taxation to the supply of women for the royal harem, was simply the expression of the power and desire of the ruler. The great advance made by Greece was to have recognised that public or common interests exist and to have provided first for their management and secondly for their study. In other words, that the Greeks were the first to rescue the body politic from charlatans and to hand it over to physicians. Again, it is almost like saying that, a governance in the hands of like these crude, ethnarchs and monarchs is not, proper government. It's only once it's handed over to these rational scientists and intellectuals is actually worth study. You can see why he would be a universalist, Zimmern. We can't allow these pesky countries to self-govern. They all have to subsume themselves into this international whole. How great an achievement this we can best recognise when we consider how large a place the true study of politics and the terms and ideas to which it has given rise fills in the life of the modern man, especially of the modern Englishman. Justice and liberty, law and democracy, parliament and public opinion, all these and many more we owe to the peasants and craftsmen of the small Greek republics who, having felt the need for a better management of their humble concerns, set to work to provide it with the same inventiveness, the same adaptation of means to end, which led them in other fields to the invention of the classic temple or of the drama. If it is going too far to say that every modern politician owes his stock in trade of general ideas to the Greeks, there are certainly few who do not owe them their perorations. This is not the place to enlarge on the features of Greek political organisation, or to point out the various elements in Greek political theory or practice which has proved of permanent value. Only a very summary appreciation can be attempted, but certain points can be picked out as being of special interest to the citizen of today. In the first place, the Greeks, having made clear to themselves that public or common affairs existed, sat down resolutely to study them, convinced believers in reason that they do not fall into the convenient English fallacy of believing that institutions are not made but grow, or that difficulties which seem too thorny for timid fingers to touch will settle themselves by being left alone. Political problems, they felt, were caused by men, by the interaction of human wills and desires, by men, by the conscious and deliberate application of human intelligence. They could and must be solved. In spite of their belief in mysterious powers which control the destinies of men and nations, did not think it decent to abandon public affairs to Providence, nor did they avert their gaze from them as too mundane for the squeamish intellectual to handle, and turn them over to the tender mercies of the ignorant and their scrupulous demagogue or doctrinaire. Their public affairs were no more interesting than ours. They were indeed considerably less interesting, unless we are prepared to argue that the election of generals to command an army, far smaller than the Swiss, is a more interesting issue than the choice of a government to bear rule over 400 million men on 5 continents, or that the question of peace or war between two small neighbouring mountain territories outweighs in interest the discussion of the relations between the white and yellow races of mankind. Well, I'm sorry, Zimmern, the local people are best to look after their own interest, and trying to subsume everything into this international structure is not workable. I'm sorry. And if Greek politics were not interesting in themselves, they suffered still further by comparison with the other topics which lay ready to claim the Greek citizen's attention. The modern voter, which is too idle to cast his ballot, will give up to business or to pleasure, to motor car and music hall, the time and the trouble that he owes to humanity. When the Athenians spent a hot and exhausting day, for why should we think their nerves less susceptible to glare than ours, listening to a parliamentary debate or to a lawsuit on a hard stone seat in the open air, he was postponing till tomorrow, or till his crops and fruit trees permitted him the leisure, discussion of some masterpiece of drama or some new issue of human thought, which had leapt during the last few days or months from the brain of a fellow citizen into immortality. If it is hard for the citizen in New York to spare the time to dethrone Tamari, or for the electors of Great Britain to uproot its more outwardly respectable analogue on this side of the Atlantic, when his life and his newspapers are full of vulgar and ephemeral distractions, how much harder must it have been for a Euripidean enthusiast or a student of Socrates or Protagoras to descend 4 long days to solid earth in order to strike a bargain with a Thracian chieftain, or to assess some poor devil's damages in drachma? Let us honour, no pity or despise them for having thought it right to do so, for having deliberately determined to infuse into public affairs, in themselves so drab and dull, so deficient in the fineness and subtlety which characterise men's more intimate concerns, the interest derived from the very fact that honest, sincere, and able minds devoted themselves to their study. As Huxley could have made the geological procession of the ages revolve around a piece of chalk, and Sir Richard Owen reconstruct primitive man from the bone of his great toe, so the citizen of Athens, as we see him depicted for us in the pages of Thucydides, could raise the great permanent issue of politics, and cause them to remain living for us 2,000 years later in debates which were ostensibly concerned with the mere provincial trivialities. When such was the atmosphere created, no wonder that those who stayed away were held up to obloquy in an expression of which our English idiot is the exact transcription. Let us dwell for a moment on the attitude of mind in which the Greek citizen approached political problems. He was both a conservative and a radical, or rather he brought to politics the best of conservatism together with the best of radicalism. He was a conservative because he reverenced tradition and recognised the power and value of custom. None of our modern conservative writers and defenders of the existing order, not Burke himself or Bismarck or Chateaubriand, had a deeper sense than the Athenian for those unwritten ordinances whose transgression brings unmitted shame. Athens was a conservative democracy. Most democracies, despite the labels of their politicians, are in reality conservative. For the common man whose regime they represent is conservative from the very nature of his life and occupation. It takes leisure and travel, or a wider education than any democracy has yet bestowed on its young people, to lift the minds of the mass of man out of the rut of habit. But Athens was far more conservative than the modern democracies with whom we are acquainted, where the British public rebukes an awkward writer by conspiring to boycott his books, so that unless he has private means, he is eventually silenced, where the United States, going a step farther, denies works the privilege of the males. Athens does not scruple to administer hemlock, and if an elite is indignant or sorrowful, the democracy applauds. Even at the height of the recent Red Terror of the United States, never went so conservative as this. The Red Terror he's talking about the Red Scare of 1919-1920, where there was a fear of a communist takeover in the United States. But him talking about censorship and political persecution, well, I'm sorry, it's necessary because you have to stamp out the subversion in your society. I mean, him referencing Hemlock, he's talking about the death and execution of Socrates. But Socrates was sentenced for wanting to corrupt the youth of Athens. He was encouraging his students to indulge in atheism and question the existence of God. And as he stated earlier, the Greeks took faith and politics seriously. They saw the two intertwined. So they couldn't just allow him to subvert the very foundations on which their society was built upon. So, as I said elsewhere, Socrates got what he deserved. They should help us to realise the rock-firm base of tradition of use and want, of patriarchal sanctities, which underlay the working 5th century Athenian democracy as we watch its apparent vicissitudes. The citizen could use his mind as freely as he would on the material presented to him for his consideration, but there was a point at which the state and his own instincts cried halt, and except in rare cases he obeyed. It is only fair to add that the most enlightened modern opinion would entirely support the Athenian view against the discussion of unwritten laws in Parliament. The difference between the conservative Athenian Democrat and the modern liberal in such matters is not that the one refuses what the other demands, the discussion of life sanctities in Parliament and law court, but that the one appeals to custom and the other to conscience as the sanction of the unwritten law itself, whether it be the God or man, the law of the hearth or of the heart, that is at issue. Both agree that what is private and holy has no place in the forum of common debate. But within these well-recognised limits, the Greek citizen was a radical. That is to say, he was ready to apply his reason to public affairs without fear or prejudice. He loved straight and sincere thinking. He tried hard to face the real situation before him, not only to be clouded or led astray by side issues or inhibitions. I mean, I would argue it's more a case that the Athenian citizen was a radical and not so much the Greek citizen, because Athens was really the only Greek city-state that was a democracy. Most other governments were either monarchies or oligarchies. So politics was kept out of the reach of influence of the common mass. There is many a lesson in common honesty to be learnt from by our politicians and public in the speeches of Thucydides. Shallow critics have been known to dub them cynical, an adjective which the English adepts in self-deception are fond of applying to nations sincerer in self-analysis than themselves. When we refuse formally to reopen an issue on which action is in fact being taken daily, because it is a party question and the coalition government is in our power, when we leave to the healing mercies of time a problem with regard to which an action itself constitutes a policy, when we deliberately invent party labels or election cries designed to confuse the mind of the voter and to distract him from the real issue, when our politicians have become professionals in the art of what Thucydides described as the use of their phrases to arrive at guilty ends, and a British Premier more euphemistically as political strategy, we might do worse than to sit down to read, mark, learn, digest and apply to our modern situations the immortal speeches or essays in which Thucydides lays bare for us the heart of the political life of his day, and to let them act as a purge of some of our own too sugary diet. The bitter sweet of truth is not always popular on the hustings, but it is good feeding for the plain citizen, whether ancient or modern. This leads on to a further reflection. The Greeks, in their political thinking, were essentially realists rather than idealists. This is true of all Greek writers, even those who, like Plato, starting from the marketplace of Athens, led us up to a utopia in the clouds. They were realists in that they based their political studies on the world as it is and human nature as it is, rather than on some personal and fanciful conception of what man and the world ought to be. To put it in other words, they are realists because they are psychologists, because they applied the psychological method to political problems. That they were the first to do so goes without saying, but no one before them had applied any method at all, except in the most rough and ready manner. But they did it so perfectly, with such utter and artistic simplicity, that those who followed them accepted or criticised their results without observing the basis of human study on which they were built up. And it is only in quite recent years, through the work of patient inquirers who, like Graham Wallace, have laboured systematically in both fields, that politics and psychology have once more been drawn together. It may perhaps seem strange to a modern reader to be told that, in this very important respect, Thucydides, Plato, and Aristotle are sounder in their method than their whole long line of political thinkers, and statements up to our own day. Let the reader who doubts it turn to the text. He will find that all the three writers whom I have named toiled at the study of human nature before they set pen to paper. The Republic opens with several books of psychological analysis, no doubt at times a little fantastic in its attempts at premature classification, but full of life and reality, not only Greek reality, but human reality. Aristotle proceeds his work on politics, in which he embodied the results of a study of all the available political and constitutional material of his day. For a Greek could work like a modern German or American thesis scrubber when he tried, with a book on ethics which still regarded quite rightly as a standard work for the modern student. As for Thucydides, his knowledge of men, the fruit of patient experience deepened by disappointment, is felt behind every line of his book, as one describes it in the features of his undegenerate descendant Venizelos, Venizelos being the Prime Minister of Greece around this time. Turn now to the moderns, where in Hobbes or in Bentham, in Locke or Burke or Rousseau, in the individualists or the socialists, the Hegelians or the anarchists, did we find, until quite recently, a really wide and open-minded attempt to see world as he is. Our ears are assailed by the chorus of catchwords based on some arbitrary and ephemeral estimate of man's reactions to outward events and institutions. Men argue backwards and forwards as to whether human nature can be changed, whether man is guided solely by self-interest, or is only waiting to be set free from sordid cares to be guided solely by his love for his fellows, whether fear or hope, custom or the sense of adventure, from his natural and most compelling spur to action. Meanwhile, in the great debate, in Burke's Reflections, as in Marx's Capital, in Maynham, Mill and Mazzini, as among the hacks who vulgarise their results in textbooks and election literature, man as he has vanished behind a cloud of doctrine or verbiage, we need the simplicity or cynicism of the Greeks to recall to us realities. Let's for a moment imagine Thucydides face to face with the problems of our post-war world of today. We've only to read his immortal analysis of the war mood of Greece and of the nervous and emotional phenomena which accompanied it to realise that his first effort would have been to explain to us ourselves. He would not allow us to acquiesce idly in our vague disillusionment, our impatience of foreigners, our suspicion of the idealisms of the Wilson brand. Interesting that he calls Wilson's worldview suspicious, considering he also was one of the prime pushers of the idea of the League of Nations. He would trace our discontent ruthlessly to its sources and hold up to our eyes the strange compound of sorrow and fatigue, impatience and disappointment, aspiration and helplessness which makes us what we are. The war mood brought with it many and terrible symptoms such as have occurred and will always continue to occur, so long as human nature remains what it is, though in a severer or milder form. According to the variety of the particular cases, Thucydides would have had eyes for it in all its forms, mild or severe, simple or complex, pitiful or repulsive. It would show us the English upper and middle class, shaken out of its comfort and complacency, its easy and patronising security, by the shock of war and bereavement, facing a future of unknown and terrifying ideas and forces, with the brutal tax gatherer administering the coup de grace to its equanimity, the working class, called to fight for a cause which it but dimly understood, and a hope of a new world which victory was to call into being, exhorted by the nation's leaders to be as daring in its home policies as in the trenches, and then confronted with a world of failing markets and impoverished customers, with the full rigour of the merciless laws of supply and demand, which, just because it had wished them out of existence, it had grown accustomed to believe could be ignored, oscillating, according to age, temperament, or experience, between resignation and impotent fury, between old-fashioned trade unionism and the latest fashion in extremism. France emerging, nerve-racked from a 50 years obsession and a 5 years nightmare, half dead with sorrow and suspense, yet too proud in victory to own a weakness, looking round, half defiant, half wistful, among our allies for one who can understand her unspoken needs, and longing with all the intensity of her sensitive nature to be able to resume, in security and quietness of mind, the arts and activities of normal life in which she has been and will be again the Athens of the modern world. Germany, tougher in fibre than her western neighbour, yet equally shaken and exhausted, a land of sheep without a shepherd, rushing hither and thither, seeking for a direction and a Weltanschauung, her amazing powers of industry and concentration, and a rich and turbid life of feeling running to waste for lack of channel guidance. Belgium self-confident and industrious and rejuvenated. Italy made one at last in measuring her strength to face the tasks of a new epoch in her history. And behind the great new surging world of the Slav, from the disciplined enthusiasm of Prague under her philosopher president to the birth agonies of a new Russia in the grip of the rough tyrant physicians of the Kremlin, all this modern Thucydides would attempt to set before us, not forgetting the conservative forces and the gods of the older generation. The great Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Socialist, traditions, the power of the bankers and the merchants, the universities and the press, and all the various types of humanity produced and all marked by their activity. And not till then, having shown us what we are, each of us in his niche and all of us together in our little corner in the vast temple of mankind, having made us see our petticisms and orthodoxies against the universal background of time and space, he would have broken silence and allowed himself to speak to us of remedies. Know yourself is the first, perhaps the only, message of the scientific historian of our bewildered age. By what right, it will be asked, is this age of Wissenschaft and Factmenschen a specialism? Just to translate, Wissenschaft is the German word for science, and Factmenschen, I'm not sure, but from the sounds of it, it sounds like matter of fact, I think is what it means. So essentially a whole world based upon science and material reality. A specialism and research institutes and organized intellectual production. Do you speak of Thucydides as a scientific historian? Here is a man who, without a university degree or any university training at all, after a brief military career for which he took no staff college course, as witness his generalship, sits down to write a chronicle of the war in which he plays a part, basing his account simply on his own experience and on the testimony of such eyewitnesses as he was able to meet. Any tyro on the history staff at a modern college or university could predict the result, one of those bulky volumes full of detail and postprandial reminiscence, in which splenetic elderly gentlemen have so often sought to justify their own existence and to call down damnation on the War Office before an indifferent public. How can anything better be expected from a mere soldier, a rough practical man, untrained in the arts of the research, in collecting facts on slips of paper and arranging and rearranging them till an induction emerges, in looking up reference books in libraries and listing them in the neat alphabetical bibliography, totally ignorant of the Hilfswissenschaften? I'm assuming that's something science related, like high science perhaps. The laborious subsidiary studies on the basis of which scientific history is built up, ignorant even of the foreign languages, who has read no sociology and is not even aware of its existence, whose geographical studies are limited to his own journeys and the tales of his friends, who finally has the impertinence to intersperse his narrative with fictitious speeches, thus destroying any pretense of a scientific character of it for his treatise, and revealing it in its true nature as a mere work of art or imagination. It may indeed be doubted whether a modern trained librarian, working according to the classification laid down by the Standard Congress Library at Washington, would, when his attention was drawn to it, admit so offending a writer onto his history shelves at all. His place, he would probably say, is with the prose poets or with the writers of historical fiction next door to them. Yet turn to the opening chapters of Thucydides' book. You will find most of the sciences on which long modern treatises are written, but you will find something more. You will find them blended into a unity. That those who deny that Thucydides was a sociologist, who continues to claim that Herbert Spencer, inventor of the horrid word, invented also the science, reread Thucydides' account of the evolution, but was as an evolution that he saw and depicted it, of Greek society from the earliest times to his own day. Let those who cry up anthropology examine into his treatment of legend and custom and his power, untrained in seminar or institute, to use it as a sociological evidence. Let the geographers, too forgetful sometimes that man is not the creature of environment alone, refresh their minds by recording those brilliant sallies in geographical thinking in which he explains some of the features of early Greek settlement and city building. It is not only orthodox history of the school of Ranker, or which Thucydides is the father and inspirer. There is not only one of the many movements which have sought to broaden out historical study in recent years, from Burke and Le Play and Vidal Leblanche down to the psychoanalysis of our own day and of tomorrow, who will not find in Thucydides some gleaming anticipation along the path of their own thought. Here we touch upon what is perhaps the cardinal merit of the Greek political thinkers, as it is of the Greek contribution as a whole. They saw all the problems, but saw each in its own place within the larger whole. They saw life steadily and saw it whole. Matthew Arnold's line is hackneyed enough, but it cannot be bettered. To put the same thought in another way, the Greeks were natural Catholics, while we of today, especially on the political field, are constantly relapsing into an unhelpful Protestantism. I find that a very interesting analogy he's drawn there. It's almost like saying that the Greeks in their politics were quite traditional, whereas the modern West were quite radical and revolutionary. I don't entirely disagree with this analogy. I know Protestants or Catholics in the chat may disagree. By Catholicism, I mean nothing doctrinal or indeed religious at all, but simply the habit of mind which insists on looking at the whole before the parts, at setting the common before the sectional interest, and in sweetening and harmonizing the inevitable contrarieties and the antagonisms of life by remaining steadily conscious of its major and reconciling interests. A Catholic is one whose intellect, to use the words of Newman himself, despite his religious label, one of the greatest of the tribe, cannot be partial, cannot be exclusive, cannot be impetuous, cannot be at a loss, cannot be patient, collected, and majestically calm, because it discerns the end in every beginning, the origin in each end, the law in every interruption, the limit in each delay, because it ever knows where it stands and how its path lies from one point to another. Protestantism, on the other hand, is the attitude of protest, of revolt, of indignation, the spirit which is conscious only of what it is against, and is too ignorant or too angry to survey the whole field of problems involved in its protest or to think out an alternative scheme. If the Greeks can render us no other service in our discontents, they can at least lift us, by the example of their wide and fearless vision, out of petty Protestant rebelliousness and recrimination, and plant our feet solidly on the rock of steady Catholic thinking. Take a few instances drawn from Plato of what I call the Catholic spirit. Perhaps the most difficult and unsettling of all our modern problems is that of the relations between men and women in the society which has granted, or is about to grant to women, complete equality of rights and opportunities without having effected the corresponding inner revolution of thought and sentiment. Masculine society, in other words, despite a multitude of professions, has not yet admitted, still less assimilated, the educated women into its ranks. Here is a problem with far-reaching and most difficult implications which Plato discussed more than 2,000 years ago, but in how different a spirit from so many of us of the feminists of today. Not that he was less advanced in his speculations, he was ready to face all that there was to face and to go a good deal farther in his suggestion of policy than would be regarded as principle in modern English or American review. But his spirit is throughout perfectly serene and, in the best sense of the word, scientific, so that he can work out his argument to the end without a trace of squeamishness or false modesty. Where shall we find in our modern discussions of women's employment, equal work for equal pay, and the like, the central points are simply and clearly stated as in the following sentence? Then, if we find either the male or the female sex excelling the other in any art or other pursuit, we shall say that this particular pursuit must be assigned to one and not to the other. But if we find that the difference simply consists in this, that the female conceives and the male begets, we shall not allow that this goes any way to prove that a woman differs from a man with reference to the subjects of which we are speaking, and we shall still consider that our guardians and their wives should follow the same pursuits. If all our modern discussion were as clean and direct as this, we should have made greater progress in the subject by now. Greek intellectual integrity and clarity of thought and expression were not hampered by a festering and obstructive legacy of what it is liable on the great movement to describe as Puritanism. Take a second example, the influence of occupation on character. This is a subject which goes to the root of many of our social problems, for till we have studied the reactions of different classes of employment, not only on the body but of the mind, perfected our methods of vocational guidance, we shall still have left open one of the greatest avenues to unhappiness. The modern inquirer will find a very interesting adumbration of this line of thought in a republic, and if here, as in the problem of relations between men and women, he finds Plato's remedy somewhat drastic and is inclined to dissent from his veto on actors and acrobats, let him consider the appalling extent to which, during recent generations, the consumer has been pampered at the expense of the producer, and ask himself how often, when he attends a music hall as a narcotic after a distracting day, and when he rings up on the telephone or books a ticket at a railway office, he considers the kind of life to which he is an accomplice in condemning those who minister to his needs and desires. Plato believed in the value of beauty, and being more than a mere modern aesthete, he was no skin-deep creed. He knew and understood the vital significance of rhythm and harmony, of grace and freedom, in the outward order of life as in the soul, and if he found himself plunged down in the centre of one of our modern hives of progress, he would have some searching questions to ask. For absence of grace, he tells us, and bad rhythm and bad harmony are sisters to bad words and bad nature, and we would not only have our guardians reared among images of evil, as in a foul pasture, and there day by day, and little by little, gather impressions from all that surrounds them, until at last a great mass of evil gathers in their inmost souls, and they know it not. Has the most widespread malady of our time ever been better diagnosed? And do not our capitalist and socialist physicians, with their merely material remedies, look very small by the side of this commanding and convincing simplicity of statement? We have dwelt upon some of the special directions in which Thucydides and Plato can be of help to us. Let us now turn briefly to the third of the great triad. Aristotle is, of course, the most systematic thinker of the three, and it's just for that very reason that the two elements already noted in Greek political thought, the local and ephemeral and the universal, are most closely interwoven and most baffling to disentangle. Tutor of Alexander though he was, his mind is incapable of stepping outside the great city-state framework. His ethics is half a treatise on human nature, half a book, akin to the characters of Theophratus, on deportment for a Greek citizen. No wonder that successive generations of English undergraduates have failed to respond to the human excellence or social charm of his hero or paragon, described as the big-souled or magnificent man. Similarly, The Politics is a book in which it needs a trained reader already familiar with Greek life to pick out the universal form, the particular, and draw his own modern conclusions. But when you have read, say, the first book of The Politics in this spirit, when you have ruled out from what is said of the state all that pertains solely to the city, when you have made allowance for the hazardous biological, psychological, and sociological generalizations, man is more of a political animal than bees or other gregarious animals. He who is by nature not his own but another's, and not a man is by nature a slave. The state is by nature clearly prior to the family and to the individual, since the whole is of necessity prior to the part, based, as the examples show, on the embryonic condition of those sciences at the time. You have a large residuum of practical wisdom that is and will remain of value to the modern world. Let us look for a moment at one element in this legacy, for it has recently become a subject of much controversy. Aristotle's conception of the state and its relation to other social and political groupings. As already been said, Greek political thought is open to criticism for unduly neglecting the claim of the individual. Aristotle was no less to this indictment than either of his great compeers. He does indeed allow for certain favoured individuals an inner or theoretical life, as he calls it, remote from the concerns of the city-state, enormous except for its excessive intellectuality, recalling the monastic ideal of the Middle Age, but this is only for the fewest. Nevertheless, it involved the admission that behind the citizen remained the man, who might conceivably on occasion have his rights, that political science, as he says, does not make men, as Thucydides regards Athens as making Athenians, but receives them from nature and uses them. And the justification for this taking over of human nature by the states, this subjection of man of the great whole or part of his nature, is clearly set forth. It is that man, when perfected, i.e. taken over and educated by the state, is the best of animals, but when separated from law and justice, he is the worst of all. Or as he puts it in another place, the man who does not participate in state or city life is either a beast or God, more likely, as the order of the words indicates, the former. In other words, it is law and justice, not as Thucydides would have it, an exaltation of the spirit to its highest power, nor as Plato preaches some organic identification between the inner life of the soul and outward order of society, which is the basis and justification of politics. It's justice, he says, using the word in the strict, not a platonic or metaphysical sense, which is the bond of men in states and the administration of justice, i.e. the determination of what is just, which is the principle of order in political society. Now, with this principle clearly laid down, and with the claim of the individual thus partially or at least implicitly recognised, it is easier to understand Aristotle's intransigent attitude towards the claims of associations other than the state, a point on which much recent controversy has turned. Every state, so its politics open, is an association of some kind, and every association is established with a view to some good. But if all the associations aim at some good, the state or political association, which is the highest of all and which embraces all the rest, aims in the greater degree than any other at the highest good. In other words, in cases of conflict of allegiance between the state or political association and some other form of grouping, of a church or trade union or professional or humanitarian organisation, the claim of the state must take precedence. Yeah, I would agree with Aristotle. The loyalty to your country or government, I think, on some level, should precede that of any humanitarian organisation, because ultimately that's something that's globalist. I mean, in terms of church or trade union, I can understand particular loyalties to that, but I think, humans are more complicated than that. They don't just have, mono loyalties to one thing or another. This doctrine has been much attacked as involving an indefensible state absolutism, a denial of personality to lesser groups, even as a negation of the right to lesser loyalties. Mr. Figgis, in a number of his suggestive, if unconvincing writings, has recalled the theories of the Jesuits and other anti-state minorities, Protestants, on this subject, reinforcing them from the nonconformist and trade union theories or inclinations of our own day. And a whole school of younger progressive intellectuals made bold to follow him. The assault on state sovereignty has, however, already been brought to a standstill by an impact of facts. Strange as it may appear in an age of sectarianism and rebel theorizing, The war revealed the truth that the mass of mankind now, as in ancient Greece, respond as at need to the call of citizenship. That when a cry goes up, summoning each and all to the tents, it is not to this or that little tabernacle, but to protecting shelter of the larger and more truly representative state organizations to which men flock, that the sects and conventicles which have fed the enthusiasm and provide the activity of leisure hours cannot maintain their appeal when the whole fabric of our society is in danger. Exclusive of those who refused allegiance on true grounds of conscience, and a despicable remnant who shammed a similar conviction, the number of Englishmen who definitely set allegiance to some other political or social grouping before allegiance to the state were surprisingly small. So this are fundamental loyalties or the dictates of an unanalyzed common sense unaffected in this country by fine-spun theories and arguments. But what we call common sense views, after all, can be analysed and sought to be analysed. And there is a very sound and practical reason, as Aristotle knew, why men prefer the state to lesser associations is because the state leaves them more free. Those who talk of state absolutism are ignoring the simple truth that there is no tyranny like the tyranny of near neighbours. The smaller the group, the tighter stranglehold over your life and activities. Groups and lesser loyalties are highly necessary and indeed desirable in our modern large-scale society, but they involve men, and especially weak-willed and thoughtless men, in far greater dangers than their larger citizenship. What the confessional at its worst may be to a woman, professional or business or other loyalty may be to a man. The modern world is full of men who have bartered away their integrity of soul to preserve the unity of the party, or to the unbroken tradition of the organisation of the interests of the trade, or even the existence of the business. If the secrets of all hearts could be revealed, how many high officials and dignitaries in church and party, in trade union and employers' federation would be discovered to be thinking and even saying in private what their lesser loyalties forbid them to proclaim in public to their fellow guildsmen. The state in its larger field may sometimes commit terrible blunders and even crimes, but at least in these days of large-scale government, it does not expose its citizens to the daily falsehoods and hypocrisies, to the insidious clogging of the wheels of progress with the grit of petty personal considerations, which seem inevitable in the life of these smaller groupings of men and women. Seen in this light, the state stands out as the guardian not only of justice but of freedom, of an inner freedom of soul and spirit, with which the professional and syndicalist attitude of mind is so often in flagrant, if unavowed, contradiction. If all this was not visible to Aristotle when he penned his immortal opening paragraph of the Politics, he at least entitled to the credit of having laid his doctrine of state sovereignty on a foundation so sure that over 20 centuries of discussion from the Stoics and Cynics through Augustine and Dante down to Rousseau and Lenin have not been able to shake it. Against church and Soviet, as against sage and hermit and anarchist, the territorial state still holds its own over the whole civilized world, and the latest construction of idealism at Geneva, misnamed though it is but an association of such states far larger indeed in average size, but of the same kind in composition as those upon which Greek philosopher fixed as the true object of political study, and the most effective and enduring agency for securing a good life for civilized mankind. But again, sorry, I disagree with Zimmern here. The nation state is important, but this idea that the League of Nations is some, it's only a union of these different nation states, therefore it's just one big nation state, is folly. Internationalism can never act in the interest of any individual state, and trying to subvert all state interests, as Aristotle rightly pointed out in his Politics, is not in your national interests. And no, it's completely wrong. And I think what's interesting is Zimmern is almost in being very disingenuous here. What are the chief and most enduring thoughts which contact with the Greek political thinkers leaves with us? They are surely twofold. The first concerning the material of politics, the second concerning the men and women of today, who, according to be citizens, public affairs, we feel, so far from being a tiresome preoccupation of a dirty business, are one of the great permanent interests of the race. If they were not too trivial or too debasing, for great artists like Thucydides and Plato, we need not fear lest that they be too trivial or debasing for ourselves, and if they are not beneath our study, neither should they elude it by being enwrapped in clouds or rhetoric or in the cotton wool of sentimentality. The Greeks should teach us once and for all that the common affairs of mankind are matter to think about as well as to feel about. What distinguishes what we call a good statesman and the public-spirited citizen from their less truly political colleagues is not that they have warmer feelings. There are as many affectionate sons and loving husbands among the tools of politics as among the elect, but the fact that by a resolute use of the related powers of intellect and imagination, they've been able to raise their feelings on a higher plane and to face great issues with a mind attuned, not to the familiar appeal of hearth and home, but to grander and more difficult music of humanity. The psychologists are teaching us in the individual life how we can sublimate our emotions when life denies them an outlet on the level of our demise, by raising them to a higher and more rarefied range of feeling and action. As we sublimate our love of individuals, so we can sublimate our love of country, not quenching and denying our patriotism, but consciously dividing and apportioning it. We must learn to preserve for our own blood and nation that precious part of our gift of service which, just because it is intimate and of the family, cannot be offered directly to humanity. But we must learn also the more difficult lesson of transferring to the international stage, the arena where men, because they are men, labour at common tasks and seek a greatest common measure of cooperation, all these interests and loyalties which safely and rightly belong there. This is the claim and call of the modern Caesar, whether his separate capitals remain, as they are today in London, Paris, Washington, and other centres of state sovereignty, or whether mankind can rise, if not in our own day, to the level of a single allegiance. We shall neglect that call at our peril, for unless we render unto Caesar that which is properly his, unless we discard our unthinking and divisive nationalisms, our noble sentiments will avail us nothing, and in the civil war of the angels, patriotism against patriotism, Mammon and Beelzebub will come into their own. In the days of large-scale organisation and mammoth syndicates, it takes a Caesar, a multinational government, to keep a giant trust at bay. He had the land of the Washington and Lincoln been broken up into the separate governments instead of drawn together into a single territory of the United States, private interests would have taken and defeated each government in detail, and freedom would have vanished from the land, unless indeed in some conflict of devil of bank and railroad against oil and lumber, the angels crept once more into their own. Again, I do think he's being disingenuous here, this idea that, because the United States is a union of many different American states, therefore universality and internationalism must trump any national interest. That's not a fair comparison, because the United States is a decentralized federation of different states belonging to European peoples of European stock. That's not the same as like putting, Britain and India as part of the Commonwealth, for example. Right. The same reasoning applies to smaller governments in other continents today. Local patriotism, as well as stripling David in the face of the Goliath of modern commercialism. More and more men will be driven, if not by reason, then by exploitation and suffering, to learn the lesson of what is still mistakenly thought of as imperialism, until they find themselves crying out with the apostle of the Gentiles who fought his own battle against nationalism, "I appeal unto Caesar." And it's interesting you're saying that, Reginald Cornwallingford, because Zimmern did actually belong to the tribe, at least on his father's side. So, yeah, every single time. But the Greeks have a message for us, not only as regards the material of our politics, but as regards ourselves. What can we do to help humanity forward in these problems of its common affairs? The age of utopia dreams is over. We now know that modern science has made the world one place, and that the social salvation is not to be found, as the early socialists imagined, by fleeing from the haunts of men and founding some model city in a wilderness. We must make our contribution here and now, in the drab world in which fate has set us. If we cannot hope to turn it into a utopia, let us at least make it as much like utopia as we can. This, after all, is Plato's message, even in the most idealistic and visionary of his books. The famous passage is worth quoting in detail. And do you think any less of our argument because we cannot prove that it is possible to found a state of the kind we have described? Surely not, he said, and do not compel me to show that what we have decided in our argument could in all respects be reproduced in experience. If we manage to discover how a state could be organized in any close correspondence to our description, then you must allow that we have discovered that your commands could be realized. Will you not be content with that? I certainly should be. Yes, I will, he said. Then next, apparently, we must try to discover what is the smallest change by which a state might arrive at this matter of constitution. Most certainly, he said. Well, there is one change, I said, which I think we could certainly prove would bring about the revolution. It is certainly neither a small nor an easy change, but it is possible. What is it? He said. Now, I said, I am at the very topic which we liken to the greatest wave. Spoken, however, it shall be, even though it is likely to deluge me with laughter and ridicule. Consider then what I am about to say. Sayani said, unless I said lovers of wisdom bear sovereign rule in states, or those who are now called sovereigns and governors become sincere, incapable lovers of wisdom, and government and love of wisdom be brought together, and unless the numerous natures who are present pursue either government or wisdom, the one to the exclusion of the other, be forcibly debarred from this behaviour, there will be no respite from the evil. My dear Glaucon, for states nor, I fancy, for humanity, nor will this constitution which we have just described in our argument come to that realization which is possible for it to see the light of day. It is this which has for so long made hesitant to speak. I saw how paradoxical it would sound, for it is given to few to perceive that no other constitution could ever bring happiness either to states or individuals. Thus far, the philosopher of antiquity, his words are sometimes interpreted as a cry for some philosopher genius to take the task of government out of our too feeble grasp, but that is not his message for us. The age in which philosopher emperors were possible has passed beyond recall. To us, Plato's words are an appeal to become, each and all of us, in our own sphere, lovers of wisdom according to the measure of our ability. If we would amend the world around us, and it is sore need of amendment, our first duty is to eschew falsehood and to follow a truth in our own lives, in our thoughts and actions. Revolution spring not from without inwards, but from within outwards. And is often when the external world seems most sick and sorrowful, when selfishness and irresponsibility sit enthroned in the world's seats of government, that the power of truth is most active in the silent region of the soul, strengthening it in order that it may issue forth once again to oppress man's unconquerable purpose of order, justice, and freedom upon the recalcitrant material which forms the stuff of men's common problems on this small globe of ours. And that is the end of that. So yeah, a bit of a long essay, and so I'm going to wrap it up there. But you can see how he, though trying to present himself as honestly engaging with the material, I think he's ultimately trying to twist the Greek philosophy and political thought to his own sinister globalist devices. So thank you everybody for watching. As I said earlier, if you'd like to support my work, please join the channel. You'll have access to many paywalled streams behind the paywall. And let me see if we've had any super chats. Okay, no super chats. So again, thank you all for watching. Next week we'll do another episode of the Archival Discourses. Yeah, I will say at the moment it will probably be because after I did the anti-American establishment stream, I'm very interested in looking at all the various Milner Group members and the stuff they wrote, because it's very vital for understanding the world we live in today. And also, just to shill, on Saturday at 7 p.m. GMT, I'm going to be joined by Charlemagne once again. We're going to be discussing a book he wrote about on his blog on Substack, titled Rich Relations, The American Occupation of Britain, 1942 to 45. So if you're interested in that, please give that a watch as well. So thank you all for watching, and good night.